The military jet touched down just after sunrise, a stark contrast to the desolate landscapes General Marcus Hale had commanded for 6 grueling years. He'd led troops through brutal conflict zones, made life-or-death decisions, and carried the weight of countless lives on his shoulders. Now, the war was behind him. Ohio, his home state, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where his 74-year-old mother, Evelyn, sat on her porch, complaining about the weather and refusing to admit her age. That image had been his anchor through endless dark nights. But the homecoming wasn't the triumphant return the governor and cameras expected. Marcus slipped away, his only mission to surprise his mother. An hour later, he stood frozen, staring at a collapsing wooden shed on the edge of an abandoned industrial lot. Inside, wrapped in old blankets beside a rusted space heater, was Evelyn, the woman everyone had assured him was living comfortably in the home he'd paid for. And when she saw him, there were no tears of joy, only a look of pure, unadulterated terror. 3 days earlier, Marcus had been full of anticipation. He'd planned the surprise, imagining her face when he knocked on the door. But as he drove through his old neighborhood, something felt off. Familiar storefronts were gone, replaced by glass towers and luxury apartments. Billboards featuring a smiling man in an expensive suit, Victor Kane, declared, "Building the future of Ohio." The area felt wealthier, yet colder. His pulse quickened as he approached the family home. Then he slammed on the brakes. The house stood, but it was wrong. Different porch furniture, vanished flower beds, unfamiliar cars in the driveway. A middle-aged man answered his knock, confusion turning to discomfort when Marcus asked for Evelyn Hale. "Evelyn doesn't live here," the man said, his eyes shifting nervously. "She moved out months ago." A woman appeared, adding quickly, "She left voluntarily. That's what we were told." Voluntarily? His mother, who had lived there for decades, whose expenses he'd meticulously covered? Nothing made sense. The polite closing of the door left Marcus reeling. But years of military training kicked in. When information didn't make sense, you gathered facts. He spent hours asking questions. Former neighbors, local store owners. Most avoided eye contact. Some claimed ignorance. Others seemed genuinely nervous. Finally, an elderly mechanic quietly pointed him toward the industrial district. "I've seen an older woman matching her description out there." The industrial area was a wasteland of abandoned warehouses and rusting equipment, not a place for anyone to live. He parked and walked, his heart pounding, until he saw it. The leaning shed, its roof patched with mismatched metal, windows covered with cardboard. The door was ajar. Inside, sunlight pierced through gaps in the walls, illuminating an old folding chair, a rusted heater, and a pile of blankets. And there, on those blankets, was Evelyn, thinner, her gray hair longer, her coat worn and stained. "Mom?" The word was barely a whisper. Evelyn looked up, her eyes meeting his. Shock, then fear, flooded her face. She stood so quickly the chair nearly tipped. "Marcus, you shouldn't be here." He crossed the room in seconds. "What happened? What happened to you?" Tears blurred his vision, but Evelyn wasn't looking at him. Her gaze darted towards the door, towards the road, as if expecting someone. "You need to leave." Marcus stared at her, utterly bewildered. Leave? After finding her like this? Then he saw it. A faded yellow and purple bruise near her wrist. The soldier in him recognized it instantly. Someone had hurt her. Who did this? Evelyn's face went pale. For a moment, he thought she would finally explain. Instead, she shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. In a frightened whisper, she uttered the name he'd seen plastered all over town. "Please, don't go after Victor Kane." Her words sucked the air from the shed. Marcus, who had commanded thousands, negotiated ceasefires, and faced death, was unprepared for the raw fear in his own mother's voice. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why shouldn't I go after him? Please, Marcus. Did he do this to you?" Her eyes dropped to the floor. The silence was his answer. A cold anger, far worse than explosive rage, settled deep within him. What happened to the house? Evelyn sank heavily into the folding chair. "I don't want to talk about it here." Marcus found Claire, a former military intelligence analyst, now working as a private investigator. He showed her the deed, the one he'd found hidden in Evelyn's meager belongings. It was a transfer of property, signed by Evelyn, granting ownership to Victor Kane. But something was off. The signature looked forced, the notary stamp smudged. Claire confirmed his suspicions. "This is real. I know county formatting. This is legitimate." "What does it mean?" Marcus asked. "Not enough information," Claire replied, frustrating him, but she was right. One page was a doorway, not proof. They needed what was hidden behind it. Their search began with Richard Kane, Victor's father, a local developer from decades past. He'd been successful, respected, but not nearly as wealthy as his son. Then, 22 years ago, Richard abruptly abandoned a major development project without explanation. A year later, he died of a heart attack at 62. An archived article contained a photograph. A younger Victor, almost identical to the man on the billboards, standing beside his father. Then Claire noticed something else. Zooming in on the community gathering photo, Marcus froze. Partially hidden at the edge of the frame was his mother, Evelyn. She hadn't just known Richard Kane, she'd been present at events with him, close enough to appear in photographs. The realization left Marcus deeply unsettled. That evening, he returned to the motel with copies of everything. Evelyn was sitting outside, watching the sunset. She looked cleaner, calmer, but the sadness remained. He sat beside her, placing the photograph on the table. Her entire body stiffened. "You knew him?" "Yes," she said, her voice distant. "We served on a neighborhood committee years ago, back when the area was struggling. He wanted to redevelop several blocks. We disagreed." "About what?" "The people living there." She swallowed. "I saw neighbors." Marcus finally understood. She hadn't been socially connected to the Kanes. She'd opposed them. That explained some things, but not all. "What about the agreement?" Evelyn looked at him, her face paling when she saw the photocopy. "Where did you get this?" "County records." The answer seemed to frighten her even more. This wasn't ordinary fear. This was the terror of a buried secret crawling back into daylight. "What is it?" She closed her eyes, looking exhausted, older than ever, like someone carrying a decades-long weight. "That document was never supposed to be public." "What document?" "It's part of a settlement between you and Richard Kane." His stomach tightened. Every answer opened another door. What kind of settlement? Before she could answer, a sharp, unexpected knock echoed at the motel room door. Marcus, his military instincts flaring, moved to open it. Standing outside was Victor Kane, impeccably dressed, silver-haired, with a calm, controlled expression. His eyes briefly flickered past Marcus to Evelyn, then back. "I've been trying to reach you, General Hale." Victor glanced at the document still visible on the table. For a split second, a flicker of genuine concern crossed his composed face, then vanished. "I think," Victor said carefully, "we need to have a conversation before your mother tells you the wrong version of what happened." Marcus felt Evelyn grip the arm of her chair behind him, hard. He looked back at her, realizing she wasn't afraid of Victor's arrival. She was afraid of what Victor might say next. Marcus stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The parking lot was nearly empty, streetlights flickering above cracked pavement. Victor stood perfectly still, calm, controlled. Marcus hated that calmness. "What are you doing here?" Victor explained his version of events, a carefully constructed narrative of a legitimate business transaction. He claimed Evelyn had willingly sold the house years ago, that the settlement was a generous offer to help her relocate, and that her current living situation was her own choice. He even offered to help her find a better place, a thinly veiled attempt to control the narrative and keep her silent. But Marcus saw through the facade. He saw the cold calculation, the practiced manipulation. He saw the predator. He confronted Victor with the evidence Claire had uncovered, the suspicious signatures, the sudden abandonment of Richard Kane's project, the timing of his father's death. Victor's composure finally cracked, a flash of anger in his eyes. He threatened Marcus, reminding him of his military record, hinting at ways to discredit him. But Marcus, a man who had faced down far greater threats, was unmoved. "You underestimated my mother," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you're underestimating me." The confrontation ended with Victor retreating, his calm exterior shattered. Marcus returned to Evelyn, and together they pieced together the truth. Richard Kane, Victor's father, had been a ruthless developer. He'd wanted to seize the neighborhood, but Evelyn, a respected community leader, had stood in his way. The settlement was a forced agreement, a legal maneuver to silence her opposition and eventually claim her property. Richard's sudden death, Marcus now suspected, was not a coincidence. Victor had simply picked up where his father left off, using the same tactics, but with even greater ruthlessness. The fight was far from over. Marcus, with Claire's help, launched a full-scale investigation. They uncovered a web of fraudulent property transfers, intimidation, and legal loopholes exploited by Victor Kane and his associates. The media, initially skeptical, became allies as the story of the war hero and his displaced mother gained traction. Victor Kane, once the untouchable developer, found his empire crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny and legal challenges. Months later, investigations continued. Compensation funds were established for displaced residents, housing assistance programs expanded, and many victims received settlements, allowing them to rebuild their lives. But Marcus wanted something more permanent, something to prevent another Victor Kane from ever doing the same thing again. Working with Claire, local attorneys, and community leaders, he helped create a legal aid organization focused on elderly homeowners, providing free consultations, document reviews, and fraud prevention. At the opening ceremony, Marcus stood quietly at the back, avoiding the spotlight. Watching people receive help mattered more. Claire found him afterward. "You finally won." Marcus smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel like winning." She nodded. Some losses remained. Years could not be returned. Trust could not be perfectly restored, and pain did not disappear because justice arrived. But something important had changed. People were safe. That mattered. The following spring, Evelyn moved into a modest apartment overlooking a public park. It wasn't luxurious or large. She didn't want either. It had sunlight, a small balcony, a kitchen she loved, and neighbors who greeted her by name. For the first time in years, nobody controlled where she lived. Nobody pressured her to leave. Nobody treated her like an obstacle. One afternoon, Marcus arrived with groceries. He found her sitting by the living room window, sunlight filling the room. Outside, people walked along winding paths through the park. Evelyn looked peaceful, truly peaceful. Marcus set the groceries down and stood quietly beside her. Neither felt the need to speak immediately. After everything that had happened, silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. Evelyn eventually smiled. "You look different." Marcus laughed softly. "So do you." And it was true. The woman sitting by the window was not the frightened figure he had found in that abandoned shed. Her dignity had returned. Her independence had returned. Most importantly, her sense of home had returned. Marcus looked through the window toward the afternoon sun. For years, he believed peace meant winning battles, surviving wars, defeating enemies. Now he understood something different. Peace was smaller than that, quieter. It was knowing the people you loved were finally safe. It was sitting beside them without fear. It was no longer carrying every burden alone. The sunlight stretched across the room. Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned back comfortably in her chair. Marcus remained beside her, watching the park beyond the glass. For the first time since returning home, he stopped looking over his shoulder. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe the fight was over. And for the first time in a very long time, both mother and son simply rested.